The Black Copycat, by A.I. Poe, and edited by Danny Murphy. I don't expect anyone to believe my story. I can hardly believe it myself. However, I'm not crazy, and I'm not dreaming. The thing is, I'm going to be executed tomorrow, and today I want to unburden my soul. A man or woman facing execution usually wants some opportunity to present his or her side of the story. I'm simply presenting a series of ordinary events. The consequences of these events have terrified, tortured, and destroyed me. I will not attempt to explain them. Someday, perhaps, a calmer and more logical editor will reduce this story down to an ordinary succession of natural causes and effects. Ever since I can remember, I have been gentle and even docile. Other children made fun of me. I was fond of animals, and my parents gave me a great variety of pets. I spent most of my time with them, and I enjoyed feeding and caressing them. My pets became my principal sources of pleasure. Other pet lovers understand. There is something special about the love one gets from a dog or a cat. I married young, and my wife liked pets as much as I did. We had birds, goldfish, a dog, rabbits, a small monkey, and a cat. The cat was large and beautiful, entirely black, and very wise. My wife was superstitious, and she regarded black cats as witches in disguise. She didn't make a big deal about it, though. We named the cat Pluto, and it was my favorite pet. I alone fed him, and he followed me wherever I went in the house. I could hardly prevent him from following me through the streets. Our friendship lasted this way for several years. As my drinking increased, my general temperament and character took a dark turn. I grew moody and irritable, and I became abusive toward my wife. My mood swings affected my pets as well. I neglected and mistreated them, except for Pluto. However, as my alcoholism got worse and Pluto grew older, even he began to experience the effects of my nasty temper. One night, returning home from one of my watering holes and very intoxicated, I sensed that the cat was avoiding me. I seized him. Frightened, he bit my hand. The fury of a demon possessed me. I took a penknife from my pocket, opened it, grasped Pluto by the throat, and gouged one of its eyes from the socket. I shudder as I remember this damnable atrocity. After I got over my hangover in the morning, I was horrified and remorseful. I again plunged into excess, and I soon drowned my memory of the deed in whiskey. The cat slowly recovered. He looked awful, but he no longer appeared to be suffering. My one-eyed cat went about the house as usual, but, as might be expected, fled in extreme terror at my approach. It grieved me that this creature, which had once so loved me, didn't seem to like me anymore. This feeling soon gave place to irritation. Then a spirit of perverseness came upon me. Perverseness is one of the primitive impulses of the human heart. Who has not found himself committing a reprehensible action simply because he could? This spirit of perverseness overwhelmed me. The longing of my soul urged me to continue and finally to consummate the injury I had inflicted upon poor Pluto. One morning, in cold blood, I slipped a noose around his neck and hung it to the limb of a tree. Hung it with tears streaming from my eyes and with the bitterest remorse in my heart. Hung it because I knew that it had loved me. Hung it because I knew that in so doing, I was committing a sin, a deadly sin that would jeopardize my immortal soul, even beyond the reach of the infinite mercy of the most merciful and most terrible God. That night, I was aroused from sleep by the sound of sirens from fire trucks. The whole house was ablaze. With great difficulty, my wife and I made our escape. The destruction was complete. My entire worldly wealth was in cinders. I became very depressed. I can't prove any cause and effect connection between the atrocity I'd committed and the disaster. I'm simply reporting a sequence of ordinary events. The next day, I visited the ruins. The walls, with one exception, had caved in. The remaining wall, which was not very thick, was in the middle of the house. A crowd of people gawked at the wall. They were closely examining a particular portion of the wall. The words, "strange," and "weird," and other similar expressions excited my curiosity. I approached and saw the figure of a gigantic cat with a rope around his neck. The picture was accurate and eerie. When I first beheld the image, I was terrified. I recalled that Pluto had been hung in a garden adjacent to the house. Upon the alarm of fire, the crowd had gathered round the garden. Someone must have cut the cat down from the tree and thrown it, through an open window, into my bedroom. This had probably been done with the intention of waking me up. The falling of the other walls had compressed the victim of my cruelty into the substance of the plaster. The flames and the ammonia from the carcass had then painted the image as I and the crowd saw it. The picture haunted me. My wife and I moved into another house, a rental. For months, I could not rid myself of the phantasm of the cat. I regretted what I had done and felt remorseful. I visited my vile haunts and began to look for another cat like Pluto. One night, as I sat, stupefied from whiskey, my attention was drawn to some black object. It was resting upon the top of a barrel of booze. I approached it, and I touched it with my hand. It was a very large black cat, as large as Pluto, and closely resembled him in every respect but one. Pluto didn't have a white hair upon any portion of his body, but this cat had a splotch of white on the front of his neck. When I touched him, he immediately arose, purred loudly, rubbed against my hand, and appeared delighted with my notice. He smelled of smoke, and there was something off about the purring. Still, he was what I was looking for. I offered to purchase it from the owner of the tavern. He had never seen it before. "If you want him, you can have him," he said. I continued to pet the cat. When I prepared to go home, it seemed like he wanted to go with me. I permitted it to do so, occasionally stooping and patting it. When we reached the house, the cat settled right in. My wife loved the cat. We named him Smokey. I soon began to dislike the cat. Whenever he did something silly, stupid, goofy, or funny, it always looked oddly familiar, like something I had seen before on YouTube. I reviewed many cat videos and realized that my new cat was nothing but a copycat. Nothing it did was original or spontaneous. When he purred, it sounded more like an electrical vibration to me. It wasn't long before I couldn't stand the sound. That's when I realized he was actually a robot. I researched robotic cats on the internet, and I found the model, Mal 666. I got the owner's manual by email. Then I started getting spammy messages about a recall. Since I wasn't the original owner, I knew that Smokey wouldn't be eligible for a recall. I marked the messages as spam and set them for deletion. Although I had been feeding Smokey and it had been using the litter box, I discovered that it didn't need to be fed at all. That was a feature that could be turned on and off. Naturally, I turned that feature off. I also found out that the purring could be adjusted, but I couldn't set it in a way that sounded natural. I became disgusted with Smokey. In time, I despised and loathed it. However, the remembrance of my cruel deed to Pluto prevented me from physically abusing Smokey. Even though it was a mere machine, it seemed to be alive. At the time, I didn't think it was right to hurt Smokey. The more I detested Smokey, the more it seemed to like me. It followed me everywhere. Whenever I sat, it would crouch beneath my chair, or spring upon my knees, or into my lap. If I arose to walk, it would get between my feet and nearly trip me. It would climb up on me, fastening its long and sharp claws to my clothes. At such times, I wanted to destroy it, but the memory of my previous crime kept me from doing so. I suspected that it was collecting data. Every time it looked at me, and every time I touched it, Smokey was collecting information and probably transmitting it somewhere. The thought of it deeply disturbed me. I reviewed the owner's manual but couldn't find out how to turn off the data collection. There wasn't one word in the owner's manual about the data or where it was going. I contacted the manufacturer, Catbots, LLC, to inquire about the data. They weren't forthcoming. Also, I had wondered about how I could return Smokey to his original owner, and I asked about that. Catbot's customer service informed me that they couldn't disclose any information about the original owner. Then they asked me if I was aware of the recall. They told me that even though I wasn't the original owner, they would send a replacement if I turned the Mal 666 over to them. Since that seemed way too good to be true, I hung up. I didn't want to be any part of whatever scam they were running. From the owner's manual, I found that I could get access to GPS data on Smokey's whereabouts for the past month. Then I drove by the address where Smokey had recently spent time. The neighborhood was nice, but the house had been burned to the ground. Apparently, this had happened the night before Smokey showed up in the tavern. The owners of the home had both perished in the fire, and the report from the fire department indicated that arson was suspected. As I sit in a jail cell, safe and somewhat sound, with time to reflect on things, I am ashamed to acknowledge the terror and horror with which Smokey inspired me. My wife had called my attention, more than once, to the character of the mark of white hair, of which I have spoken. It constituted the sole visible difference between Smokey and Pluto. The white mark had originally been very indefinite. However, it had, at length, assumed a distinct outline. It was the representation of an object that I shudder to name. It was the image of a hideous and ghastly thing, a hangman's noose. I could hardly sleep. Smokey was always nearby, watching me. When I managed to doze off, I would wake up with Smokey's fat ass on my face. Its vast weight was an incarnate nightmare that I had no power to shake off. Beneath the pressure of these torments, the feeble remnant of good within me faded away. Evil thoughts became my constant companions. My moodiness increased to hatred of all things and of all mankind. The sudden and frequent outbursts of fury to which I now abandoned myself were usually directed at my uncomplaining wife. One day she accompanied me to the cellar for some household task. Smokey followed me down the steep stairs. I nearly tripped over it. I was lucky I didn't fall headlong and break my neck. I was exasperated to madness. Taking hold of an axe, I aimed a blow at Smokey. It would have proved instantly fatal had it descended as I wished. However, this blow was arrested by the hand of my wife. This propelled me into a rage beyond demonic. I withdrew my arm from her grasp and buried the axe in her brain. She fell dead upon the spot. There was a thud, but she didn't make a peep. I swear, I didn't intend to kill her. It was an accident, a horrible accident that could have happened to anybody. Forthwith, I set myself to the task of concealing the body. I knew that I could not remove it from the house, either by day or night, without the risk of being observed by neighbors. Many projects entered my mind. At one point, I thought of cutting the corpse into tiny fragments and destroying them by fire. At another, I resolved to dig a grave for it in the floor of the cellar. I deliberated about casting it in the well in the yard, about packing it in a box, like merchandise, and getting a disposal service to take it from the house. I even thought of grilling her up and eating her, but that would take too long. The flesh would rot before I could get to most of it. Finally, I hit upon what I considered the best method. I would wall it up in the cellar. The cellar was perfect. Its walls were loosely constructed and had recently been plastered throughout with a rough plaster. The dampness of the atmosphere had prevented the plaster from hardening. In one of the walls was a fireplace and chimney that had been filled up and made to resemble the red of the cellar. I had no doubt that I could readily displace the bricks at this point, insert the corpse, and rebuild the wall so that no eye could detect anything suspicious. I used a crowbar to dislodge the bricks. Then, having carefully deposited the body against the inner wall, I propped it up in a standing position. With little trouble, I restored the whole structure as it originally stood. With mortar and sand, I prepared a plaster which could not be distinguished from the old. With this, I very carefully went over the new brickwork. When I had finished, I felt satisfied that all was right. The wall did not present the slightest appearance of having been disturbed. I looked around triumphantly and said to myself, "Here at least, then, my labor has not been in vain." My next step was to find Smokey, the little monster which had been the cause of all the trouble. I had, at length, firmly resolved to destroy it. Had I been able to catch it, there could have been no doubt of its fate. However, it appeared that the crafty thing had been alarmed at my anger and would not present itself in my present mood. It is impossible to describe the deep and blissful sense of relief which the absence of the detested thing brought me. It did not make an appearance during the night. For one night at least, since its introduction into the house, I slept soundly, even with the burden of murder upon my soul. The second and third day passed, and still there was no sign of Smokey. The monster had, apparently, fled the premises forever. I would never see it again. My happiness was supreme. The guilt of my dark deed disturbed me but little. Inquiries had been made about my wife, but these had been readily answered. One night, she simply disappeared. I don't know where she went or why, I told the police. A search had been initiated, but nothing was discovered. I was free and clear and had nothing to worry about. 4 days later, the police barged in unexpectedly. They had a search warrant, and they proceeded again to search the premises. They left no nook or corner unexplored. At length, for the third or fourth time, they descended into the cellar. I wasn't worried. I was bored. The detective in charge was thoroughly satisfied and prepared to depart with his team. The glee in my heart was too strong to be restrained. I burned to say if but one word, by way of triumph, and to render doubly sure their assurance of my guiltlessness. As he ascended the stairs, Detective Columbo turned and said, "There's one more little thing I'd like to ask. I noticed the crowbar on the floor. Have there been any recent repairs down here?" I began to babble. "No, this is a very well-constructed house. These walls are solidly put together." I had a cane in my hand, and in a moment of true insanity, I rapped heavily on the wall with it, upon that very portion of the brickwork behind which stood my wife's corpse. As the reverberation of my blows sunk into silence, a horrifying noise came from behind the wall. It was like a baby's cry, at first muffled and broken, and then swelling into one long, loud, and continuous scream. It was inhuman, a howl, a wailing shriek, half of horror and half of triumph, such as might have arisen only out of hell. Nearly fainting, I staggered to the opposite wall. For one instant, Detective Columbo remained motionless. Then he grabbed the crowbar and tore the wall apart. The corpse, already greatly decayed and gory, stood erect for all to see. Upon its head sat the hideous Smoky, whose craft had seduced me into murder, and whose informing voice had condemned me to the hangman. I had walled the menacing monster up within the tomb,